Welcome back to Inside Politics. Our guest today is Steve Cavendish. He's the editor of the Nashville Scene. Just came back there after a stint in Washington. Before that, he was the editor of the Nashville City paper here in town, so he's a familiar face in the local media. Steve, you came back to the scene under some very tragic circumstances, the unexpected passing of former editor Jim Ridley. How difficult is it still in your newsroom, even a few months later, to be dealing with that loss?
I think like any organization that still has to keep going after someone passes away, there's a lot of people that have been running on adrenaline, and you know how a newsroom works. There's always some story to be chasing, and something has to be done. You're never just sitting around thinking about things, and so I think people have stayed busy.
You described Jim as a world-class human being and a great editor, so how does anybody come in to replace somebody like that? I mean, it's almost like trying to replace a saint.
Yeah, you don't. You just don't. I mean, I've got the same job title, but I'm not Jim, and I don't think anybody pretends that I am. He was the scene's maybe best writer they've ever had, one of their best editors. I was the beneficiary of that. When he would edit my stuff, it was always better than what I gave him, and I think anybody who's worked for him would tell you the same thing. You know, it's been nice having that kind of safety blanket of somebody who makes you better than you are.
Do you miss being in Washington? It's sort of the ultimate political town. I know you like to do a lot of politics.
I do, but you know, local politics is always so much more interesting than national politics. I mean, the national stuff's really interesting, but the great thing about D.C. was you had, a town that gives you Marion Barry is going to be a town that gives you great stories to cover.
Nashville gave Marion Barry to Washington.
That's exactly right. But I mean, there were so many things to cover that had nothing to do with Capitol Hill. It was great. And I think that's the thing that people don't really know about D.C. is there's this great world that exists away from the federal bureaucracy and away from the kind of the presidential stuff that people live and work and have to have a lot of the same struggles that people here do.
You described Jim Ridley's vision for the scene as powerful storytelling, the best arts coverage in town, and taking a critical eye to everything Nashville. You say that vision, but how are you going to shape it or mold it or make it a little bit different or make it your own?
Well, I think we share a lot of the same vision, but the things that I do and the things I'm interested in are probably I'm sitting here. I don't know if you ever had Jim on, but I don't know if Jim was ever one to wanted to talk about politics too much. He liked talking about stories. He liked talking about, that last year during the mayor's race, one of the things that he and I talked a lot from when I was in D.C. and he loved the story of that mayor's race and kind of the contrast that it provided, and he was very interested in how it affected Nashville and how it affected people's lives, but he wasn't a political animal.
Well, let's talk about stories in terms of taking that critical eye to Nashville. What do you, maybe some of your reporters, see as the key stories, the key trends, the key things you're going to be following here in Nashville? Let's just take it for the next 6 months or so that you think are the things you really want to be focusing on in your paper.
Well, I think this General Assembly is going to be really interesting here once we get through the elections, and I think the makeup of the General Assembly is going to be pretty much the same. Republicans will probably have a supermajority. You have a little bit, but you're going to have some challenges to leadership probably. Beth Harwell's already got an opponent. There's going to have to be some stuff that shakes out after Ron Ramsey leaves over on the Senate side. That's going to change the dynamics of the legislature, and that's going to be pretty fascinating.
And the Nashville versus the state legislature, the Republican supermajority may be up again. It looks like with what's going on this week in Nashville, coming up the next couple of weeks, with the idea of decriminalizing a small amount of marijuana, that looks like a target that perhaps the Republicans can't resist to come down and say, no, you can't do that.
That's going to be a fascinating sort of thing, because it doesn't necessarily cut across partisan lines. I think there's some people, the sort of the Liberty Caucus wing of the Republican Party, and there's a fair amount of those in the state legislature right now, that look at how we've criminalized marijuana and the effects that has on our jails and state prisons. I think the move towards decriminalization, even just in those small amounts, is to clean out some of the stuff and get on to more important issues. And that's going to cut across some lines that I think you wouldn't necessarily think. I mean, even medical marijuana, you saw some people like Steve Dickerson here in town really took a different stance than the whole traditional say no to drugs kind of wing of the party.
Now, when I pick up the scene every week or go online and to read it, I'm often struck by the huge scope and number of music, arts events, and other sort of creative activities that are going on in Nashville, certainly much more than when I grew up here. Does that make Nashville unique? Would I find that if I went to other city papers in town and found that kind of, it just seems like we have a creative class here that perhaps a little different from a lot of other towns.
It certainly skews music heavy, and that's, you're going to see that in our coverage.
It used to be the complaint was you couldn't find any live music being performed in Nashville. That is not a problem.
That is not the case anymore. You can find great music, and you can find great music across a number of genres. The country music industry here is huge, but this is not necessarily a country town anymore.
It is really a music town.
It is a music town, and there are all sorts of people. I think half's a big number. There's a lot of studio musicians in town that made their bones in rock bands throughout the 80s and 90s, and have decided that they wanted a life that they could enjoy. They found Nashville really appealing, and so now they're playing sessions. Now they're playing on other people's albums around town or in live shows.
Let's take a break. We're talking with Steve Cavendish. He's the new editor of the Nashville Scene. Of course, you can't have a conversation that even touches on politics these days without getting into the presidential race and, of course, Donald Trump. Back to get into that after this break. Stay with us.